Swinburne University of Technology.
Welcome PhD students and students interested in the artefact and exegesis model of PhD, as well of course as the traditional model. Today we're talking about examination. Dominique, Carolyn and myself have all examined other theses from other universities and also undergone examination of our own students' theses, and we'll discuss some of what we have learnt from that with you today. The trajectory of supervision is such that by the last year, which we would hope would be the third year, but sometimes is later, we are acting as quasi-examiners as well as supervisors. And perhaps we're doing that in a way all through the PhD candidature. That doesn't mean we're double guessing what the supervisor might say, but we're bringing our experience of supervision and of being examined, or our own candidates being examined, to your work. I suppose the first thing we need to think about when we're both examining and advising our candidates is what's the university regulations about this, and Dominique has some insights into this.
I would say that every university has its own guidelines, so it's very important for students to familiarize themselves with what the guidelines of the university are, because that's what the examiner will base his or her view on. However, I must say that when I examine a thesis, the first thing that I look at is the introduction or the preface, and what I'm looking for is for the rationale. I'm using this word rationale because, and not argument, because the PhD in practice-led research varies a little bit from the traditional PhD. That is, you might not necessarily have an argument that you develop throughout your thesis. You might have an argument that develops via accretion. So I look for the rationale in the introduction, and then for the originality of the work. And then I will then adapt that with the guidelines that are set by the university.
However, there are some particular things that you do need to follow, and they are in your bibliography and your referencing. And examiners can check bibliography and referencing very readily, and they often do that first up. And if you haven't got all your references right, or you haven't presented them in the same form throughout, usually the Harvard system, then examiners don't like that. And so that's something you need to pay attention to right at the end. But in the meantime, there's a lot more to pay attention to, and Carolyn might like to talk about the two elements of the examination, the artefact and the exegesis, and how they sit in the examination process.
Yeah, well, you can specify for the examiner which element you would like them to read first. I think that traditionally an examiner will read the artefact first, or view the artefact first, and as a way of just getting a sense of what the what's the outcome is, like what it is that you've been playing around with for that amount of time, and then they will turn to the exegesis and read that, and then think after they've read that whether these things that are raised in the exegesis are upheld in the artefact. So as much as they have to start somewhere, they're very much talking to each other throughout, and the examiner keeps an eye on that. And I think even though the artefact is often the longer form, say if it's a novel, it's 80,000 word, and your exegesis is around 20 to 30,000 words. They will generally give them equal weight. That's been my experience, and certainly as an examiner, that's what I will do. And I think also that one of the things to bear in mind is that you're wanting to make sure that your examiner is able to, when they're reading reading the exegesis to see very clearly what elements you're talking about relate back to the novel in what way. So you've got to always flag very carefully in your exegesis things you want the examiner to see, because remember, as we will have told you as you're working towards the examination date, you're writing for the examiner, so you can't sit there and say in the exegesis, or you can't think when you're writing the exegesis, oh, the examiner will pick this up in the artefact. You need to flag for them, and that's a really big thing, letting the examiner know how the two parts work together.
Very much so. They must talk to one another. Also, of course, the creative artefact is examined in a way that is genre-ridden. So it has to fit as, if it's a novel, as publishable, if it's a work of art, as being able to be exhibited or whatever. It has to fit the elements of the genre, as well as the exegesis has to fit the elements of scholarship. That's not to say that creativity doesn't fit into scholarship, but it's rather a challenge to scholarship to accept the creative element as scholarship in itself, so that the two elements together are scholarly. The two elements together are creative, academic and scholarly. So you don't really say this is out of 50 and that's out of 50. The whole lot's 100%. Do you think that is so, Dominique?
Yeah, I would say that it is the case. It is also the case with experimental work. Some thinking, for instance, of the works of fictocriticism, where boundaries are often blurred. However, there is rigor in the creative piece as much as there is in the exegetical piece, and it's something that students are often a little bit wary of, particularly when they start off writing up. And I think it's part of the learning process, just to be aware that, as I said earlier, it's about respecting language.
At the end of your examination, there are 4 boxes that the examiner can tick. The first is, you're terrific, everything's great, go forward. They also give a report, usually a report of 2 or 3 pages, perhaps on each element, but certainly at least a page on each element of the PhD. And that report goes back to the research committee. The research committee decide what has to be done. If the report is too far distant, then you may have to go to a 3rd examiner. Normally the examination would go to 2 examiners. The second box says, look, it's great, but you need to do minor changes according to your that you feed back to your supervisor, and your supervisor says that's okay. The third one says major changes according to your supervisor or your examiner. And the fourth one says, look, this really isn't up to scratch, you have to redo and represent. I think that's pretty much how it goes. So most of the students and most of the examinations I've done have fortunately fitted in the first or second box, and that's what we would be aiming for. So never think the second box is a bad box or even the third box. Passing is good.
Absolutely.
And the good thing about examination is that it tells you what you need to do to get the PhD. And I suppose part of what we would like to talk about here is, why are you doing this PhD? What happens after examination? Have you given any thought to that?
Yeah, look, I think that's a really big thing when you've just barreled towards this goal for 3 or 4 years, or if you're part-time, between 5 and 8 years, and you've got it in, and then life stops while you're waiting for it to come back, and it comes back. Great, you're a doctor, what do you do now? So I think that it's always important as you're moving through your candidature, particularly on the last third, to start thinking about what you're going to do after the PhD, so that regardless of what the result is, you've got some coping mechanism or some way of or somewhere to go, somewhere to project your thinking about as you're getting close to the examination coming back. So it might be be something along the lines of, well, I'm going to take some of these chapters and turn them into articles, so that you start working on that whilst it's under examination, just as a way of letting your kind of world move forward. You might be looking at sending some parts, if it's a novel, out as short stories, or looking at taking some parts of the exegesis or the artefact that you thought you could have moved in another direction, but you didn't have the time because you wanted to keep this project as it is for examination, and moving that into that new area. So accepting that this amazingly tight, cohesive piece of work that you've handed over can now have another life if you want it to. And I think for me that's a big thing, particularly with a part-time candidate. If they've gone over 7 or 8 years on this one project, they can kind of forget that there is other works of art that you can create after that. So the examination period is a good time to think about that stuff, so that you're not as anxious about getting the work back.
That's right.
I think it's a huge emotional hurdle, and it's not uncommon that people sort of unravel after they submit. So it's important to have a project. I keep saying to my students, we all need a project. So whether it's an academic project, if you want to go on in academia, which is not a given, unfortunately, but also have another project, a grant application, or a new novel to actually write. Yes, it's very important.
Yes, I think it's extremely important to know that life goes on after the PhD, and to think, why did I do this PhD, particularly with an artefact and exegesis PhD? The artefact clearly has its own creative area that it can be published within or displayed or worked within. The exegesis is a scholarly discourse, and traditionally people went through this examination process so they could become scholars within the academy. Many practitioners do not wish to become scholars, although there are many practitioner scholars. All of us have been published outside our scholarly work in a creative field. So what do you think you're going to get after the PhD examination? What has it given you regarding your creative work? All of our students, and I'm sure this is true for you too, have said, this has improved my insights into my own creativity and improved my creative work, so that it's got that circular flow. I think that's quite important, not to see the examination as the end point.
Yep. And can I ask a question of you two? What sorts of comments do examiners often return? What sorts of things do they say to students that need to be improved upon? Are there some hints we can give students?
Well, the most annoying thing for examiners are any editorial matters. Full stops, apostrophes, IT apostrophe S perhaps used in its own, or bibliographic matters. Although they are minor, they annoy the examiner, and you don't want to annoy the examiner.
Consistency of referencing as well.
Proper editing, proper formulations, and all examiners that have fed back to my students have said they are really pleased to see in the exegetical material methodological and theoretical points made in relationship to any other points. What do you think, Dominic?
Yes, I think what you are saying is quite right. The annoying things are the editorial matters, but some examiners, unfortunately, have a very strong background in editing. That's right. And of course, it reflects on the way the examining and the presentation is very important. The quality of the argumentation and the illustrating of the argument is also very important. It's not often picked up in the in examination reports, but some things are sometimes also political. So be careful if you are tackling politically sensitive issues, because you might not guess what your examiner's inclinations are like. So yeah.
So this comes back to the selection of examiners. 3 months before you are ready to submit your work for final examination, we are supposed to call for examiners. And this is quite a confronting thing for us to do, we have to find an international examiner and 2 other examiners who are expert in your field, who are also willing to examine, because it's quite a big extra on your everyday task. It's part of your collegiality within the academy to do this, but nevertheless, many people don't have the time or the energy or whatever. So selecting the examiner who's appropriate is very much what we need to do, and we don't always get that right, so we try to. And really, it's quite important for you to look at the work of the examiners if they've worked in your area, so that you are not ignoring their work and again getting their back up. Carolyn before mentioned the preface. This is something that you may or may not choose to do to your work. I have suggested to most students, not all, that they do, because it's 1,000 words that you can use to introduce the reader to the whole 2 elements of the candidacy. What do you think about the preface?
I used to prescribe the preface, but sometimes it depends on how the student is working. Oftentimes, these days, the preface is actually incorporated in the introduction.
That's right. That's right.
Because then there is a little bit more room to develop ideas in chapter 1, for instance.
Yes.
Depends how the student is working.
Yeah, as a student, I found the preface the hardest thing to write out of the whole.
Do you wish you hadn't done it?
No, I think it was good that I did, but
I made you do it.
She made me do it. She was my supervisor. But I don't encourage my students to do it. Only because, as Dominique said, I think the students and the projects that I'm working with, the introduction does that, but there may be a time when a preface is needed, and that's something you just have to trust us on. And something else that's interesting that Josie brought up is thinking about examiners in the field. You don't know who your examiner is. But it is always good just to keep an eye on all the people that are active in your field and look at their particular perspectives, so that you can put forward possibly or negotiate with us a possible list of examiners, but you won't know who your examiner is.
And you can say you don't want certain people.
There needs to be no contact when it's approaching examination. You can be people that you have interacted with previously, but you are not supposed to be interacting with them whilst it's coming up to or is under examination. But it is important to keep an eye on the people in your field, because as much as if your PhD is in an area that we are experts in, that's great. We can sort of say, look, this is in our heads, we think this is a good person to examine, etc., etc. But if for some reason you're working with someone who is not an expert in the field that your PhD is in, we may rely on you to give us, over the course of the candidature, a sense of who is a good potential examiner in that field, one of the many. So you do need to keep an eye on that.
Yeah, so go to conferences and talk to people. And one thing you can say is you can refuse to have a particular person as an examiner. So that's your right. You can't dictate to us the person you want as an examiner, but you can dictate to us the person you don't want.
And you can suggest someone.
Yeah.
And of course, it's really important to have an examiner. You spoke before about experimental works, for example, so you would need a particular person or persons who were au fait with that kind of work, or visual work, or audio visual work, or working with film, obviously. We will choose that kind of examiner for you.
An examination can take between 3 months and a year.
That's right.
Generally 3 to 4 3 to 4 months is quite normal. Would
It
you
does not sit
agree or
on our
disagree?
desk.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, yeah.
8 weeks normally.
8 weeks, sorry, 8 weeks.
But the examiner can ask for an extension, in exceptional circumstances.
Well, that's certainly not my experience of getting it through quickly, because it also has to go to the research committee, and often the research committee hasn't met for its holidays or whatever the heck. So my suggestion is that you don't think you're going to get it back for 6 months. If it comes quicker, that's terrific. But if it's slower, I wouldn't think it would be that long. But sometimes an examination can have to go to a third examiner, and that can again expand the time that it takes. So be confident that 6 months you should get a result.
Yeah. And I raise this because for people that are wanting to use the PhD to go on for further employment in academia might think, okay, my candidature is up at this date. It's been 3 to 4 years since I enrolled, then I'll have my PhD in hand and be able to apply for things that require PhDs like postdoctoral fellowships, all of this stuff straight away. Well, you probably need to give yourself, in terms of career planning, about a year after you submit, between that, it coming back, and you graduating as well, because that can be a 6 month gap depending on when your university, or us, or if you're not a Swinburne student, your university offers a graduation ceremony. So these are things that for career planning you do need to bear in mind, but not all of us worry about it, things that far in advance, but we appreciate some people might.
Look, I think the big thing is that you've been brave enough to take on this major project, you've worked on it, and you've listened to your supervisors, because we won't say it's ready until it is. So I wish you very well with your examination. Look, we've had 100% success so far, so we're going to stick with that, we hope.
Yep, and look, examination is an amazing process. You get so much out of being examined. I mean, the feedback that comes back is just so helpful, and it reassures you of your strengths, and it can help you, tweak your work if needed to be even more marketable and more publishable. We've all examined work that has gone on to be published, and we've all had our students who have been under examination. Some of them have gone on to have their work published, published novels, etc. So it is an amazing process. So as much as we're being, we're discussing it with great seriousness here, it is, you do get a lot of joy out of it as well.
That's right. Thank you, Dominic. Thank you, Carolyn. Thank you, students.
This has been a Swinburne production.